Free will accumulate narratively, but internal changes do. Characters remember, they adapt, they harden. Free will is expressed through these adaptations. Choosing violence repeatedly makes it easier. Choosing detachment reshapes perception. Choosing care, even briefly, increases vulnerability. Outcomes reset, but patterns do not. Ultimately, Rick and Morty argues that free will is not about changing the universe. It is about what a person becomes when nothing forces them to care. In a reality where outcomes barely matter, choice loses its reward, but not its cost. Characters are free precisely because nothing compels them to choose one way over another. And that freedom is portrayed as exhausting, frightening, and inescapable. Free will in this universe is not meaningful because it saves the world. It is meaningful because it cannot be avoided. What makes this conception of free will especially unsettling is that it removes the comfort of proportionality. In most moral frameworks, the weight of a choice is balanced by its outcome. Good choices lead to good results, bad choices to bad ones. In Rick and Morty, that balance is broken. Characters must choose without any reliable feedback loop. The universe does not confirm, reward, or even consistently acknowledge their decisions. This creates a form of moral vertigo in which free will exists without guidance. Because of this, free will becomes inseparable from habit. When outcomes fail to matter, repetition becomes the primary shaping force. Characters do not become who they are because of a single decisive choice, but because of accumulated micro-choices made under conditions of indifference. Rick becomes cruel, not because cruelty works, but because choosing cruelty repeatedly is easier than choosing vulnerability. Morty becomes hardened not because violence achieves lasting goals, but because exposure without resolution erodes resistance. Free will expresses itself less as dramatic decision-making and more as slow ethical drift. This drift reveals a crucial distinction the series draws between freedom and agency. Characters are free in the sense that nothing prevents them from choosing otherwise, but they are constrained by the psychological consequences of their prior choices. Every decision narrows the range of choices that feel tolerable in the future. The universe may reset, but the chooser does not. In this way, free will is cumulative rather than episodic. It builds a self even when it fails to build a world. The absence of meaningful outcomes also destabilizes justification. Characters cannot appeal to necessity, destiny, or long-term benefit. When Rick claims that nothing matters, he is not describing reality so much as defending a posture. His philosophy functions as insulation against responsibility. If nothing matters, then no choice can indict him. Yet the persistence of his avoidance, self-destruction, and attachment betrays that the cost of choice still exists, even when denied. The show also complicates the idea that free will requires optimism. Many philosophical treatments of free will assume that choice is meaningful because it leads somewhere. Rick and Morty suggest the opposite. Choice is meaningful because it doesn't. When there is no promised payoff, choosing to care becomes an act without leverage. Compassion, restraint, or loyalty have no guarantee of success. They exist purely as expressions of value, not strategy. This makes nihilism an unstable position rather than a settled one. If nothing matters, then every choice is equally permissible, but also equally revealing. Characters cannot escape self-definition. Even apathy becomes a defining stance. Rick's claim that caring is irrational does not free him from choice. It locks him into a pattern where non-caring becomes compulsory. His freedom collapses into predictability. The multiverse sharpens this paradox. Infinite alternatives do not dissolve responsibility. They isolate it. Knowing that another version of oneself made a different choice does not absolve the present one. It only emphasizes that this version chose what it chose. Replaceability does not erase agency. It localizes it. Free will becomes intensely personal precisely because it has no cosmic significance. In this framework, the most radical act is not changing the universe, but choosing consistency in the absence of validation. To care repeatedly in a universe that does not reward care is exhausting. To refrain from harm when harm is easy and inconsequential is costly. Free will is thus portrayed not as empowerment, but as burden. Characters are free to choose, but never free from what those choices do to them. By stripping outcomes of meaning, Rick and Morty exposes free will as something that cannot be outsourced to consequence. Choice remains, stubbornly intact even when nothing else does. The series does not argue that free will saves anyone. It argues that free will is what remains when salvation is no longer on offer. This framing ultimately reframes despair itself as a choice rather than an inevitability. In a universe where outcomes barely matter, despair is not the logical conclusion of nihilism, but one possible response to it. Rick treats despair as intellectual honesty. Yet the show repeatedly demonstrates that this stance is maintained through effort. Constant irony, constant deflection, constant escalation. Despair is not passive. It is actively reinforced. That reinforcement is an exercise of free will, even when it pretends not to be. What the series exposes is that meaninglessness does not flatten all choices equally. Some choices are easier under nihilism, and some are harder. Violence, detachment, and self-interest align smoothly with a world that offers no moral feedback. Care, restraint, and loyalty do not. Free will expresses itself most clearly in the resistance to what the environment makes easy. When nothing matters, choosing what costs more becomes the clearest signal of agency. This is why moments of care in the series feel disproportionate in weight. They are not important because they change outcomes, but because they contradict the logic of the universe. A character choosing to protect, to hesitate, or to stay present is choosing against the grain of reality as it has been defined. These choices do not accumulate into redemption arcs, but they do accumulate into identity. The self becomes the only remaining site where consequence still exists. The show also dismantles the idea that free will requires optimism or hope. Characters do not need to believe things will get better in order to choose differently. In fact, the absence of hope makes free will more severe. Choosing without hope removes the possibility of instrumental motivation. Actions cannot be justified by future payoff. They stand alone. In this sense, free will becomes purer and more punishing at the same time. This purity is what makes Rick's position untenable. By insisting that nothing matters, he attempts to erase the distinction between choices. Yet his behavior reveals that distinctions persist. He avoids certain losses, clings to specific relationships, and repeats particular patterns. These repetitions indicate preference, and preference implies valuation. Valuation implies choice. Rick's nihilism does not abolish free will. It traps him inside the narrowest possible version of it. Morty's trajectory reinforces this point from the opposite direction. His suffering does not come from believing outcomes matter. It comes from believing choices still do. Even as the universe refuses to validate his values, he continues to experience guilt, fear, and moral strain. These experiences are not signs of weakness. They are evidence that free will has not been extinguished. Morty pays a psychological cost precisely because he continues to choose as though choice matters. The series ultimately suggests that free will is not about effectiveness, but about exposure. To choose is to reveal oneself in a universe that offers no cover. There is no destiny to blame, no moral ledger to consult, no final outcome to redeem or condemn. Choice becomes an act of self-definition under conditions of indifference. In this light, the most devastating aspect of the show's universe is not that nothing matters, but that something still does, internally, persistently, and without relief. Free will survives not as power, but as obligation. Characters must choose, even when choosing hurts, even when choosing changes nothing externally, even when choosing leads only to further erosion. By removing the reassurance of meaningful outcomes, Rick and Morty presents free will in its most uncomfortable form, unavoidable, unredeemed, and deeply personal. Choice does not save the world. It does not fix the system. It does not guarantee growth. It only ensures that in a universe where outcomes barely matter, who you become still does. This leaves free will in Rick and Morty occupying a paradoxical position. It is simultaneously diminished and intensified. Diminished because it cannot reliably alter the structure of reality. Intensified because it operates without insulation. In a world where outcomes do not stabilize meaning, free will loses its protective buffer. Every choice is exposed as preference, posture, and self-construction rather than strategy. The series repeatedly shows that removing consequence does not remove responsibility. It relocates it. Responsibility no longer belongs to the universe, society, or narrative arc. It collapses inward. Characters cannot say, "I had no choice," because alternatives are always available. They also cannot say, "It worked," because success is temporary, reversible, or irrelevant. What remains is the uncomfortable fact of authorship. They chose this version of themselves again. This is why avoidance becomes such a dominant behavior. When outcomes barely matter, avoiding choice altogether feels like relief. Rick's reliance on substances, chaos, and constant movement functions as an attempt to outrun authorship. If life is a blur of emergencies, jokes, and distractions, then no single decision has to be owned. Yet this avoidance is itself a choice, one that produces predictability, isolation, and repetition. Free will narrows when it is used to escape itself. The show also undermines the comforting idea that freedom means flexibility. In theory, Infinite possibilities should allow infinite reinvention. In practice, characters repeat themselves. Rick remains Rick-like. Morty remains morally strained. Beth oscillates within a narrow emotional range. Jerry seeks validation in familiar ways. This repetition suggests that free will does not automatically expand under conditions of infinity. Without meaning to guide it, freedom collapses into habit. What emerges is a distinction between can choose and can change. The characters can always choose differently in the abstract, but changing requires enduring uncertainty without justification. Change would mean choosing without the protection of irony, nihilism, or inevitability. It would require acting as though something matters while knowing it may not. That is a risk the series portrays as more frightening than death or failure. This is why moments of genuine hesitation carry such weight. When a character pauses, when they do not immediately default to violence, dismissal, or self-interest, that pause represents free will in its most fragile form. It is the moment where habit loosens, but nothing replaces it yet. These moments are rare and unstable, often collapsing quickly. But their existence suggests that freedom has not vanished. It has merely become difficult to sustain. Importantly, the series does not argue that free will leads to improvement. There is no guarantee that choosing differently produces growth or healing. Free will is not framed as a path to redemption. It is framed as an inescapable condition of consciousness. Characters must choose, even when every option is compromised, even when all outcomes are hollow. The burden is not to choose well, but to choose at all. In this sense, Rick and Morty offers a deeply pessimistic but precise account of freedom. Free will does not elevate the characters above their universe. It traps them within themselves. They are free to become worse, freer to become numb, freer to repeat. Freedom is not liberation. It is exposure over time. The most unsettling implication is that the absence of meaningful outcomes does not excuse anyone. If nothing matters, then nothing absolves either. The universe's indifference does not cancel agency, it strips away excuses. Characters cannot lean on fate, morality, or progress. They are left alone with what they keep choosing. Free will, then, survives as the last, non-negotiable fact. Everything else can be replaced, reset, or destroyed. Choice cannot. Even refusing to care is a form of caring, shaped negatively. Even claiming meaninglessness is a stance taken repeatedly. The series ultimately suggests that in a universe where outcomes barely matter, free will becomes less about changing the world and more about enduring oneself. You do not choose to matter. You choose who you are, while nothing else does. That choice offers no comfort, no guarantee, and no resolution. It simply persists. And that persistence, uncomfortable and unavoidable, is the closest thing Rick and Morty offers to meaning. If there is any quiet resolution in this framework, it lies in the realization that free will does not need to be justified to exist. Rick and Morty refuses to grant it narrative triumph or philosophical reassurance. Instead, it treats free will as a background condition of consciousness, present whether or not it is useful, meaningful, or rewarded. Characters do not earn free will by believing in meaning. They are burdened with it regardless of belief. This reframes apathy as a strategy rather than a conclusion. When Rick insists that nothing matters, he is not stating a fact so much as choosing a method of coping with the pressure of authorship. If nothing matters, then no choice can condemn him. Yet the show repeatedly exposes the fragility of this stance. Rick's routines, attachments, and aversions reveal a man who is still choosing selectively, still protecting specific losses, still reacting as though distinctions exist. His nihilism is less a liberation than a narrowing of acceptable choices. By contrast, characters who continue to feel conflict, Morty most visibly, demonstrate that distress is not evidence of misunderstanding the universe, but evidence of resisting reduction. Morty's pain does not arise because he falsely believes outcomes matter. It arises because he understands they do not and chooses to care anyway. His suffering is not ignorance, but friction between values and reality. In this sense, suffering becomes a side effect of free will under nihilistic conditions. The series also suggests that free will cannot be eliminated without eliminating consciousness itself. As long as characters perceive, remember, and anticipate, they must choose how to respond. Even reflexive behavior becomes choice once it is recognized and repeated. Habit is not the absence of free will. It is free will worn smooth through repetition. Characters are not trapped because they cannot choose differently, but because choosing differently would require tolerating discomfort without narrative payoff. This perspective undermines the idea that free will must lead somewhere. There is no destination where freedom resolves into peace or clarity. Instead, free will is cyclical. Choices shape identity, identity shapes future choices, and the loop continues regardless of outcome. The universe may reset, but the chooser accumulates history. Meaning is not erased, it is privatized. What Rick and Morty ultimately refuses is consolation. It does not tell the audience that free will redeems suffering, produces justice, or guarantees growth. It tells us something colder and more precise. Free will is what remains when nothing else helps. When outcomes fail, systems fail, and meaning collapses, choice persists as a psychological fact. You still decide how to respond to indifference. In that sense, the show's bleakness is not an argument against freedom, but a stripping away of its myths. Freedom is not empowering, not hopeful, not fair. It is simply unavoidable. You cannot escape choosing by denying meaning, multiplying realities, or laughing at consequence. You can only choose what kind of person exists inside that denial. This is why the series feels emotionally heavier the more nihilistic it becomes. The less the universe cares, the more exposed the characters are. Without destiny, morality, or outcome to absorb responsibility, everything collapses inward. Free will becomes claustrophobic. There is nowhere to put it down. The final implication is unsettling but coherent. In a universe where outcomes barely matter, the only thing that cannot be outsourced is authorship. You may not control what happens, and what happens may not last, but you still control, moment by moment, the stance you take toward that fact. Rick and Morty offers no reassurance that this stance will save anyone. It only insists that it will be taken again and again, whether the characters want it or not. Free will, stripped of reward and promise, survives as endurance. not because it matters to the universe, but because it matters to the self that must keep choosing in one. At this point, free will in Rick and Morty becomes inseparable from fatigue. Choosing without outcome produces a specific kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of failure, but the exhaustion of repetition without closure. Characters are not worn down because their choices go wrong. They are worn down because their choices never finish. Nothing concludes. Every decision feeds back into the same conditions that produced it. This is why the series treats resignation as both understandable and dangerous. Giving up on meaning reduces friction, but it also reduces range. When characters stop expecting anything from choice, they stop imagining alternatives. Free will remains technically intact, but it atrophies. The capacity to choose survives, while the capacity to envision different ways of being erodes. Freedom narrows not through force, but through disuse. The show repeatedly demonstrates that nihilism does not eliminate preference. It simplifies it. Characters default to what feels easiest, safest, or most familiar. Over time, ease becomes destiny, not because the universe enforces it, but because the self does. This is the quiet trap of a world where outcomes barely matter. The absence of consequence does not produce freedom. It produces gravitational pull toward the least resistant option. What distinguishes this from determinism is that nothing compels the repetition. No law forces Rick to remain cruel, or Morty to remain conflicted. They continue because deviation feels unjustified. Without outcome-based meaning, change feels arbitrary. Why choose differently if it won't matter? This question sounds logical, but it conceals a surrender of authorship. It replaces choice with drift. And yet, the series insists that drift is still chosen. Choosing not to choose is still a posture. Choosing habit over uncertainty is still an act. Free will does not disappear when characters give up on hope. It becomes smaller, quieter, and more mechanical. The danger is not loss of freedom, but loss of awareness that freedom is being exercised at all. This is why moments of clarity, when a character briefly recognizes that they are repeating themselves, feel so destabilizing. Recognition reintroduces authorship. It removes the comfort of inevitability. Once you see the pattern, you cannot fully hide behind it. Even if nothing changes afterward, the choice to continue carries a different weight. The show never allows this recognition to crystallize into reform, but it allows it to exist. That allowance matters. It suggests that free will persists not as a path to escape, but as a constant interruption, an unwanted reminder that one could act otherwise, even if one does not. In a universe where outcomes barely matter, the most consequential thing is not what happens, but what becomes tolerable. Free will operates at the level of tolerance. Each choice redraws the boundary of what feels acceptable next time. Violence becomes easier. Detachment becomes normal. Care becomes costly. These shifts are subtle, cumulative, and irreversible in feeling, even if the universe resets. The series therefore presents free will as something that does not announce itself. There are no triumphant decisions, no final stands. There is only the quiet accumulation of stance. Who you are is not decided by a single choice. but by what you keep allowing yourself to do without protest. This makes the show's philosophy more unsettling than simple nihilism. It does not say that nothing matters. It says that mattering has been relocated entirely into the self, stripped of reinforcement, stripped of relief. You are free, but only inside a loop you help maintain. In that sense, Rick and Morty offers one of the bleakest but most consistent portrayals of free will, not as power, not as salvation, but as persistence under indifference. You choose because you cannot stop choosing. You become because you cannot avoid becoming. And the universe does not care either way. This framing leaves free will not as a heroic capacity, but as a kind of psychological gravity. It pulls continuously, subtly, shaping behavior even when characters wish it would stop. In Rick and Morty, no one gets to opt out of authorship. Even surrendering to meaninglessness is an authored stance, one that must be maintained through repetition, reinforcement, and self-narration. The show quietly suggests that the most damaging illusion is not that outcomes matter, but that they are required for choice to be meaningful. Once that illusion collapses, characters face a harsher truth. Choice does not disappear when its rewards do. It simply becomes harder to justify. This is why characters cling to irony, chaos, or distraction. These are not expressions of freedom, but strategies to dull its weight. Irony, in particular, functions as a buffer against authorship. By treating everything as a joke, characters keep their choices from solidifying into commitments. Nothing is taken seriously long enough to become binding. Yet irony must be chosen repeatedly. It is not neutral. Over time, it reshapes perception, narrowing emotional range and making sincerity feel dangerous. Free will survives, but only in forms that protect against exposure. The series also dismantles the assumption that moral clarity strengthens free will. In a world without stable outcomes, clarity can become paralyzing. Knowing that one's values will not be rewarded does not empower action. It intensifies vulnerability. This is why characters often retreat from clarity into ambivalence. Ambivalence diffuses responsibility. It allows movement without direction. But ambivalence, too, is chosen, and it accumulates. What emerges is a portrait of freedom without redemption. There is no final decision that resolves the tension between care and indifference. There is no synthesis where nihilism and morality reconcile. Instead, the show presents a continual negotiation carried out under conditions that make every option feel compromised. Free will is not the solution to this condition. It is the condition. This reframes the audience's role as well. Viewers are not invited to judge characters based on outcomes or arcs, but on patterns. What matters is not what Rick or Morty accomplish, but what they keep choosing to tolerate. The show asks whether endurance without reflection is itself a choice, and whether refusing to imagine alternatives is a form of quiet consent. In this sense, Rick and Morty does not deny free will. It denies its comfort. It strips away the narratives that usually soften choice. Progress, payoff, redemption, destiny. What remains is a raw, persistent demand to take responsibility for one's stance in a universe that offers no reassurance in return. The unsettling implication is that freedom is not something to be achieved or defended, but something to be endured. You do not arrive at free will. You are subjected to it. It does not guarantee dignity, improvement, or meaning. It only guarantees that you are implicated in what you become. And that implication does not fade, even when the universe resets, even when outcomes dissolve, even when nothing seems to stick. The world may forget, but the chooser does not entirely. Habits remain, tolerances shift, selves harden or fray. In the end, Rick and Morty suggests that the most radical question is not whether free will exists, but whether one is willing to remain conscious of it when nothing else seems to matter. The series offers no answer, no prescription. It only shows what happens when that consciousness is avoided, eroded, or briefly reclaimed, and then carried forward again into a universe that will not care either way. Free will persists, stripped of meaning, reward, and promise, as the last unavoidable burden of being aware. Carried to its furthest implication, this portrayal suggests that free will in Rick and Morty is not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived pressure. It is felt as tension, irritation, guilt, boredom, and exhaustion rather than as empowerment. Characters are not dramatizing freedom, they are coping with it. The show strips away the fantasy that freedom feels expansive. Instead, it presents freedom as something that presses inward when nothing external provides direction. What makes this pressure uniquely corrosive is that it cannot be shared. Outcomes can be collective, but choice is solitary. Each character experiences authorship alone, even when acting alongside others. Rick's choices isolate him not because he is cruel, but because no one else can carry the weight of his stance for him. Morty's distress is similarly isolating, because no one else experiences his moral friction in quite the same way. Free will becomes the most private burden in a world otherwise defined by excess and spectacle. The series also implies that the desire to escape free will often masquerades as the desire for control. Rick seeks mastery over reality not to exercise freedom, but to eliminate the need for deliberation. If everything can be calculated, destroyed, or reset, then no choice needs to linger. Control becomes a way to anesthetize responsibility. Yet control fails repeatedly because it cannot erase preference. Even omnipotence cannot prevent caring selectively. This is where the show's use of scale becomes philosophically significant. By inflating stakes to cosmic proportions, it exposes how little scale actually helps. Bigger consequences do not restore meaning, they only accelerate fatigue. When everything is extreme, nothing is grounding. Free will does not become easier. When the universe is vast, it becomes harder to justify. The self shrinks in proportion to the scale of indifference around it, making each choice feel simultaneously trivial and inescapable. Over time, the character's relationship to choice becomes procedural. They do not deliberate deeply, they default. This defaulting is not instinctive but learned. It is the result of repeated exposure to consequence-free action. Free will remains, but it is exercised through pattern rather than reflection. The danger here is subtle. When choice becomes automatic, it stops feeling like choice at all. Responsibility persists, but awareness fades. The series treats this fading awareness as the real loss, not morality, not meaning, not even hope. but attentiveness to authorship. When characters stop noticing that they are choosing, they become lighter, faster, and more functional, but also flatter. They lose the friction that once made decisions painful. Pain in this context is not a flaw. It is evidence that choice is still being felt. This is why the show never fully erases discomfort. Even at its most cynical, it allows moments of irritation, regret, or hesitation to surface. These moments are not redemptive, but they are diagnostic. They indicate that free will has not vanished, only been buried under repetition. The self still reacts, even when it no longer hopes. In this light, the absence of resolution is not narrative laziness, but philosophical consistency. Resolving free will would require either restoring meaning or eliminating consciousness. The show does neither. It leaves characters suspended in awareness without payoff, choice without guarantee, agency without progress. This suspension is the point. Within Rick and Morty, free will is not the power to change the universe, nor the illusion that one does. It is the inability to avoid shaping oneself in a universe that refuses to care about the result. Every stance hardens into habit. Every habit narrows the next choice. Nothing forces this narrowing except the chooser. The bleakness of this vision lies not in meaninglessness, but in persistence. Choice does not end when meaning does. It continues quietly, relentlessly, asking the same question over and over without offering reassurance in return. Given that nothing will matter, what will you keep doing anyway? The series never answers that question. It only shows what it costs to keep asking it and what it costs even more to stop. What ultimately distinguishes Rick and Morty's treatment of free will from traditional nihilism is that it refuses to let indifference become neutral. The universe may not care, but the characters do not become inert. Instead, indifference becomes an environment that actively shapes what kinds of choices feel survivable. Free will is not erased by meaninglessness, it is bent by it. In this environment, the most consequential decisions are not dramatic acts, but thresholds, points at which a character decides what they will no longer resist. These thresholds are rarely acknowledged explicitly. They appear as small concessions, laughing instead of objecting, complying instead of refusing, disengaging instead of caring. Each concession feels minor because outcomes barely matter. Yet together they define who the character becomes. Free will operates not through grand moments, but through quiet permissions. This is why the show's characters so often feel trapped without being constrained. There are no bars, no rules, no destinies forcing their behavior. What traps them is the accumulation of tolerated states. Once something becomes acceptable, it becomes repeatable. Once it is repeatable, it becomes expected. Free will narrows not because options disappear, but because deviation begins to feel unjustified, even irrational. The series also exposes how easily the language of rationality can be used to anesthetize choice. Rick frequently frames his decisions as logical responses to an illogical universe. Yet logic here functions as camouflage. It hides preference behind inevitability. By claiming that caring is irrational, Rick attempts to convert choice into necessity. The show repeatedly undermines this move by showing that Rick's rational behavior is highly selective, emotionally patterned, and personally costly. Logic does not free him from choice. It excuses him from examining it. What emerges is a model of free will that is deeply uncomfortable because it offers no moral leverage. You cannot point to the universe and say, "This forced me." You cannot point to outcomes and say, "This justified me." You cannot even point to your past and say, "I am fixed." You can only point to what you keep doing. Free will becomes less about what you can choose and more about what you continue to choose once resistance feels pointless. The show's refusal to grant catharsis reinforces this idea. If there were a moment where free will paid off, where caring led to lasting good, or detachment led to peace, it would validate a strategy. Instead, every strategy erodes. Caring hurts, detachment hollows, control isolates, surrender stagnates. Free will does not offer a correct answer, only trade-offs. And because outcomes barely matter, those trade-offs are internal, cumulative, and irreversible in feeling. This is where Rick and Morty diverges from simple despair. It does not say that nothing matters. It says that mattering has no audience. There is no external judge, no cosmic ledger, no final reckoning. What remains is self-consistency over time. Free will persists as the mechanism by which a person becomes legible to themselves, even when no one else is watching. In that sense, the show's bleakness is precise rather than nihilistic. It does not deny agency. It overexposes it. It asks what freedom looks like when stripped of purpose, reward, and myth. The answer it offers is not liberation, but responsibility without relief. You are free, but only to decide what kind of person continues under conditions that will never affirm that decision. This makes the absence of resolution not a failure, but a thesis. If the universe does not resolve, neither can free will. It can only persist, reshaping tolerance, hardening habits, and quietly defining the self through repetition. In the world of Rick and Morty, free will is not what saves anyone from meaninglessness. It is what forces them to live inside it consciously. Choice remains, not as hope, but as exposure, a continual demand to author oneself, even when nothing else will remember, reward, or care. And that demand does not end. It cannot be escaped. It can only be endured, pushed to its limit. This perspective reveals that free will in Rick and Morty is less about deciding what to do than about deciding what to normalize. When outcomes barely matter, the decisive question shifts from "what will this cause" to "what am I willing to live with?" Choice becomes a process of habituation. The self is shaped not by intention, but by accommodation. This is why the show repeatedly returns to the erosion of boundaries. Characters do not abruptly abandon values, they adjust them incrementally. Each adjustment feels justified by context, fatigue, or irony. Over time, these justifications accumulate into a worldview. Free will is exercised not in moments of clarity, but in moments of concession. What you allow once becomes easier to allow again. What you tolerate becomes what you expect. What you expect becomes who you are. The absence of meaningful outcomes accelerates this process. When actions do not lead to lasting external change, internal change becomes the only residue. Characters cannot point to results to explain themselves. They can only point to patterns. This makes repetition more important than intention. It does not matter what someone claims to believe if their behavior keeps reproducing the same stance. Free will reveals itself through consistency rather than declaration. The show also suggests that refusing to choose is impossible. Even passivity is a stance with consequences. Doing nothing does not preserve neutrality. It preserves the conditions that already exist. In a universe defined by chaos and indifference, inaction becomes endorsement by default. Free will operates even when characters try to hide from it, because not acting is itself an action, within a system that continues regardless. This is where the series' bleakness becomes unusually honest. It does not pretend that there is a morally correct way to exercise free will that guarantees peace. Every posture exacts a cost. Caring leads to pain without payoff. Detachment leads to numbness without relief. Control leads to isolation. Surrender leads to stagnation. The universe does not adjudicate between these costs. The chooser must live with them. Importantly, this does not mean all choices are equal. They are unequal in how they reshape tolerance. Some choices make future choices harder. Others make them easier but narrower. Free will is not evaluated by outcome, but by trajectory. Who you are becoming matters more than what you achieve, precisely because achievement is unstable. The show's refusal to allow lasting growth reinforces this idea. Growth would imply direction, and direction would imply meaning. Instead, the series allows awareness without transformation. Characters often recognize their own patterns, articulate them with painful clarity, and then continue anyway. This is not hypocrisy. It is the cost of choosing in a world that offers no incentive to change. Awareness does not dissolve habit. It only makes repetition heavier. This leads to the most unsettling implication of all. Free will does not guarantee dignity. You can choose freely and still become diminished. Freedom does not protect against erosion. It enables it. When nothing intervenes, the self wears down under the weight of its own accommodations. This is not punishment. It is accumulation. In this sense, Rick and Morty presents free will as something closer to gravity than to liberation. It is always acting, always shaping, even when ignored. You do not escape it by rejecting meaning. You only lose the stories that once softened its effects. The series ultimately suggests that the question, does free will matter, is misframed. Free will does not need to matter to exist. It operates regardless of validation. The real question is whether one remains attentive to it or allows it to harden into habit without reflection. That attentiveness is costly. It offers no solution, only discomfort. And so the show ends where it always does. Not with an answer, but with continuation. Characters keep choosing, not because they believe it will lead somewhere, but because choosing cannot be turned off. Outcomes dissolve, universes reset, narratives loop, but the self carries forward, slightly altered by what it has learned to accept. In a universe where outcomes barely matter, free will survives not as purpose, but as residue. It is what is left behind when everything else fails to hold. And Rick and Morty insists relentlessly that this residue is enough to shape a life, even when it is not enough to save one. Taken together, this makes free will in Rick and Morty inseparable from maintenance. Choice is no longer a moment of decision followed by resolution. It is an ongoing act of upkeep. Characters must continually maintain the versions of themselves they have already become. The effort is not in deciding, but in sustaining the stance they have normalized. This is why the show so often depicts characters returning to familiar behaviors after moments of clarity. Insight does not erase the cost of maintenance. Choosing differently would require rebuilding habits, tolerances, and emotional expectations from scratch, without assurance that doing so would improve anything. In a universe where outcomes barely matter, rebuilding feels unjustifiable. Maintenance, even of something broken, feels efficient. The result is a form of existential sunk cost logic. Past choices do not trap characters causally, but psychologically. Having already paid the cost of becoming someone hardened, detached, or compromised, reversing course would mean paying again without refund. Free will allows reversal, but does not make it cheap. The more a character has adapted to indifference, the more painful sincerity becomes. This helps explain why the show treats sincerity as volatile. When sincerity appears, it destabilizes the system because it interrupts maintenance. It raises questions the characters are actively working not to ask. Choosing sincerity would require dismantling the habits that keep them functional. Thus, sincerity is often deflected, mocked, or overwhelmed by chaos. Free will is exercised defensively to preserve the status quo. Importantly, this does not mean the characters are lying to themselves. Many of them understand exactly what they are doing. But understanding does not negate cost. The show rejects the comforting belief that awareness automatically enables change. Awareness merely clarifies what change would demand and often confirms why it will not happen. At this stage, free will becomes almost anti-narrative. Narratives depend on escalation, decision, and transformation. Rick and Morty instead depicts choice as recursive. Characters choose, become, adjust, and then choose again from a narrower field. The story loops not because nothing changes, but because change accumulates internally rather than resolving externally. This is where the series' bleak consistency lies. It does not argue that choice is meaningless. It argues that choice is inescapable, but unrewarded. There is no finish line where freedom cashes out into peace. There is only continuity. You remain responsible for what you have normalized, even when normalization was the only way to survive. In this sense, free will becomes the quiet engine of stagnation, not because characters lack freedom, but because freedom without meaning produces conservation rather than risk. The safest move is to keep being who you already are. That safety is illusory, but it is familiar. The final implication is subtle and unsettling. The universe does not need to constrain free will to make it painful. It only needs to refuse to care. Indifference is enough. When nothing responds to choice, choice turns inward and reshapes the chooser. That reshaping continues, whether it is acknowledged or not. So Rick and Morty does not ask whether free will exists. It treats that question as settled. The question it keeps returning to is harsher and more intimate. What kind of self forms when free will is exercised in a universe that offers no reinforcement no correction, and no end? The series never answers that question definitively. It simply keeps showing the cost of answering it the same way, again and again. What lingers after all of this is the realization that free will, as depicted in Rick and Morty, is not something characters possess so much as something they endure over time. It is not activated in moments of drama, nor proven by decisive action. It is present in the slow, often invisible process of becoming accustomed to oneself. The show suggests that who a character is at any given moment is less the result of a choice than the residue of countless earlier ones that were never revisited. This makes the absence of endings crucial. Without endings, there is no reckoning. Without reckoning, free will never resolves into judgment or absolution. Characters are not asked to account for themselves in any final way. Instead, they carry forward slightly altered into the next iteration of the same conditions. Choice does not conclude, it sediments. The self becomes a layered record of what was once tolerated for the sake of continuing. The unsettling implication is that freedom does not liberate characters from this process, it binds them to it. Because no outcome settles anything, nothing interrupts the feedback loop between behavior and identity. You do not choose once and live with the consequences, you choose continuously and live with the accumulation. Free will becomes temporal rather than momentary. It operates across duration, shaping not events, but thresholds of acceptance. This is why the show feels emotionally heavier the longer it goes on, despite its episodic structure. Even when nothing sticks narratively, something sticks internally. Characters grow more efficient at their own coping strategies, and that efficiency carries a cost. The more practiced they become at detachment, irony, or resignation, the less room remains for deviation. Free will survives, but it survives inside increasingly narrow corridors. What the series ultimately refuses is the idea that freedom guarantees dignity. You can choose freely and still become smaller, flatter, more constrained. Freedom does not protect against erosion. It merely ensures that erosion is participatory. Characters are not victims of fate, but they are participants in their own narrowing, often without fully realizing when or how it happened. In this light, the show's bleakness is not about the universe being meaningless, but about meaning being unresponsive. The universe does not punish bad choices or reward good ones, so choice loses its external drama. What remains is an internal reckoning that never concludes. Free will becomes something like background radiation, always present, always shaping, never resolving. The final tension the series leaves unresolved is whether awareness can ever meaningfully interrupt this process. Characters often glimpse their own patterns, articulate them with painful clarity, and then continue anyway. The show does not mock this failure. It treats it as realistic. Awareness does not erase fatigue. Knowing you could choose differently does not make choosing differently survivable. And so free will persists in its most stripped down form, not as hope, not as salvation, but as continuity of authorship. You keep writing yourself forward even when the story goes nowhere. You keep choosing what to allow, what to excuse, what to repeat. The universe may reset, forget, or dissolve, but the chooser carries forward the shape of those choices. Within Rick and Morty, this is the quiet philosophical core beneath the absurdity. Not that nothing matters, but that something keeps happening anyway. Choice does not disappear when meaning does. It just loses its audience. And in that silence, free will becomes less about changing the world than about enduring the person you are becoming when nothing stops you. At the very end of this line of thought, free will in Rick and Morty settles into something almost impersonal. It is no longer framed as a moral faculty or a philosophical prize, but as a structural condition of being conscious in an indifferent system. The show suggests that as long as a character can register experience, preference, and discomfort, choice cannot be eliminated. It can only be minimized, routinized, or ignored. This is why the series treats collapse differently from erosion. Collapse would imply a decisive failure, a moment where choice is overwhelmed. Erosion, by contrast, happens through countless intact choices that simply aim too low. Characters are not forced into worse versions of themselves. They opt into survivable versions. Each choice is reasonable in isolation. The damage emerges only in hindsight, when the accumulation becomes visible. What makes this especially bleak is that free will does not even guarantee authenticity. Characters often believe they are being honest about meaninglessness, about selfishness, about resignation, yet that honesty still hardens into posture. Free will does not rescue them from self-deception. It merely allows self-deception to be practiced consistently. Over time, posture becomes personality. The show also quietly rejects the idea that choosing less bad is neutral. In a universe where outcomes barely matter, ethical minimization becomes its own trap. Reducing harm without questioning direction leads to stagnation. Characters avoid the worst outcomes, but never pursue better states. Free will becomes conservative rather than exploratory, preserving function instead of risking transformation. This reframes the absence of hope not as despair, but as management. The characters are not hopeless, they are pragmatic. They choose what keeps them moving. But movement without destination becomes circular. Free will fuels the loop rather than breaking it. The freedom to choose exists fully. The freedom to want something different gradually disappears. In this sense, Rick and Morty presents one of the most unsettling versions of free will in contemporary fiction. A freedom that never goes away, never resolves, and never redeems itself. It does not lead to transcendence or collapse. It leads to continuation. You choose, you adapt, you tolerate, and then you do it again. Slightly altered, slightly narrowed, still responsible. The final implication is not that free will is meaningless, but that it is insufficient. It cannot save characters from indifference, repetition, or erosion. It can only ensure that whatever they become, they are involved in becoming it. There is no external force left to blame once outcomes stop mattering. Within Rick and Morty, free will survives as the last uncompromised fact. Not powerful enough to change the universe, not fragile enough to disappear, but persistent enough to make every continuation a choice. And the show's quiet accusation is this: if nothing else matters, then the only thing left that can ever matter is what you keep choosing to accept.